Today I'm joined with a special guest. I'm here with Dr. Natalia Jaworska, who works at the Royal. Natalia, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, it's a total pleasure. I always love chatting about mental health and especially my research. In fact, a lot of people just say, okay, I'm not like super interested in this anymore. So to have the forum is actually a lot of fun. Thanks.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to have you. And I think to get started, would you mind just giving us a brief background on your education and what you do at the Royal?
Yeah, sure thing. So, I think it's always kind of interesting, especially when I talk with like students who are thinking about a scientific career, to share my trajectory, because I don't think it's particularly linear. So I studied neuroscience at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, and it just became really interesting the more I studied it. So it's pretty common that when you start in your first year, you're kind of taking, calculus and chemistry, which not so riveting. But the further along I got really interested in the human brain, and especially about mental health. And there were some personal circumstances that probably led me to be super interested in depression in particular.
Mm-hmm.
And then from that point, I kind of knew that I wanted to study depression. Now, depression in particular is, I guess, a super broad topic. You can really kind of attack it from so many different angles, like, what happens in our society, what happens in the human brain, et cetera, et cetera. So I kind of wanted to look at it from a more molecular level.
Mm-hmm.
And so I looked at sort of researchers who were looking at what might happen in the brains of people with depression. But in order to really understand that, we actually tend to look at preclinical or animal models. So I ended up going to Dalhousie in Halifax, and I studied quote unquote depression in the gerbil.
Yeah.
And the model we were using was separating baby gerbils from the mom and its litter mates. And so then we were interested in, well, what happens to the brains of these gerbils when we use this model,
Right.
when these little babies grow up. And so that was actually really interesting, because we found some sex-specific differences between the gerbils, and indeed there were some behavioral profiles. But it kind of became apparent to me that I really liked humans more than kind of animal work.
Yeah.
Because ultimately depression is, something that's quite specific to humans. Like, you can model certain things in animals, but you can never ask an animal, like, are you depressed? Are you feeling blue, kind of a thing. So I took a year off and started looking about, who does kind of the depression work that I would be interested in humans, but still focusing on the brain.
Yeah.
And then that took me, after sort of a gap year, to Ottawa, which is where I started looking at brain profiles in depressed individuals using something called EEG, where we look at electrical brain patterns.
Mm-hmm.
And I was actually really interested in using those electrical brain patterns to predict who would do well on a particular type of antidepressant, because that's sort of a gap that we currently have, is kind of matching intervention to particular individuals. And then after that, I did my training first in Calgary, where I started sort of looking at the brain in a slightly different way and moving my research a little bit more towards younger people. So 16 to 24-year-olds, their brains continue to develop, and looking at the effects of various kinds of interventions in those folks. Mm-hmm. So that included exercise intervention, brain stimulation therapies, and in addition to pharmacotherapy. And then after that, I did some more training at McGill in Montreal, which was also focused quite a bit on young folks and more looking at the brain at risk. So is there something about the brains of individuals who are at risk for certain kinds of mental illnesses that we might be able to better understand? And then after all that training, I finally got to open up my own lab in Ottawa. And it's sort of been a similar path, where I really look at what's going on in the brain in the context of mental health, and what do various types of interventions do to the brain. And, you obviously kind of branch out a little bit. So I have also been doing some work in schizophrenia and some more online type research, again, looking sort of at wellness in young adults and those sorts of things. But that is my extremely long-winded answer of how I kind of wound up where I am and how I'm kind of doing what I'm doing at the Royal currently as a scientist that works there.
Right. Yeah. You have a very extensive background in neuroscience and psychology. And I think if we're going to talk to, or if I'm going to talk to anybody about exercise and the effects it has on the brain, you're a perfect candidate. And I do want to get into all the effects that exercise has on the brain positively, how it affects stress, anxiety, depression. But before we get right into that, I just want to ask you a more general question, which is, what is it about neuroscience, psychology, and mental health in general that you find that makes you so passionate about it, or that you get very interested in it for?
Yeah, so I think maybe the simplest answer is kind of how gray it is. I find the spaces in between kind of the most interesting. And I think the intersectionality between like human behavior and, our emotions and the fact that they're ultimately kind of governed by our brain to be so fascinating. And I just think it can also be a very hopeful profession or field of study because there is so much to still understand. Sometimes it can be a little bit disheartening because we don't really have the answers and, we don't quite understand how to make people feel better. But I think it truly is the complexity of it that's always been very intriguing. And also just this ability to work with wonderful people, whether they're students or clients or, in some cases, physicists, where we all kind of bring our expertise in order to essentially study certain issues in mental health and the brain. It just makes for a really fun but super challenging work environment that personally for me is very cool. It's certainly not for everyone, but I think it's a really rewarding space to be in.
Yeah, it must be rewarding, especially to be able to see some of the patients or people that you're working with make progress through your interventions. And that's kind of what fascinates me about the whole field of mental health psychology is that it has such a wide effect on people. I know that the leading reason for disability in Canada is mental illness.
Yeah.
And also just the cascading effects that a mental struggle can have on your life is incredible. Like dealing with anxiety or depression can affect so many different areas of your life. But on the positive side of that is if we're able to provide improvements to your mental health, it'll also have a cascading effect, and your life, your relationships may improve, the productivity of you at school or work may improve. And yeah, that's just amazing to think about, that the brain it's essentially like the operations center. And if we really focus on that, we can have such a widespread improvement on people and maybe society in general. And with that being said, let's dive into some of the benefits of what exercise can bring to people. And to start off, let's talk about stress, because stress obviously is something that affects everybody. And I think these days, maybe more than usual, people might be stressed out. There's the COVID-19 pandemic going on right now, and all the issues that come along with that. It's election time. There's political conflicts. There always seems to be something in the news that is stressful or some sort of problem. So, how does stress affect the brain, and where can exercise come into play to help out with the issues that stress causes?
Right. It's such a good question. And there really isn't like a super simple answer, because it never is. But I think one thing that's sort of important to highlight is like not all stress is bad. I
Right.
mean, stress can be a huge motivator, and it's actually like a really adaptive feature for us as a species, all species, because when you're stressed out, you can actually optimize performance. Now, that sounds really jargony, but I think a good example is like a certain amount of stress can actually help you perform quite well, whether it's at a sport, whether it's on an exam, whether it's in public speaking. It can basically optimize your cognitive functioning and sometimes physical functioning. But, it can very quickly become dysregulated. So some people, when they are overwhelmed with stress, that completely debilitates them. You end up kind of choking
Yeah.
when you're supposed to be giving that lecture or whatnot. And
Right.
another thing that we know is that really chronic, sustained, unchecked levels of stress can have pretty detrimental effects. So we know that from a body perspective, but we also know that from a brain perspective. So ultimately, I mean, in really kind of simple terms, what occurs when we have these chronic levels of stress is we have a lot of circulating steroids like cortisol, which when it goes unchecked and it's kind of circulating in our bodies at really high levels, eventually makes its way into our brains as well. And there's been quite a bit of nice work, especially from animal studies, where basically so much stress kind of floods our brains and eventually starts to kind of eat away at it in the simplest of terms. So one specific area that we study a lot is the hippocampus. It's just kind of a famous brain region because it is kind of a region that seems to be most susceptible to stress. So it becomes this kind of model for the rest of the brain in order to study the effects of stress on the brain. And probably it has to do with the fact that it's one of the few brain regions that continues to have new cells that grow within it in adulthood. So there's kind of brain cell turnaround in that hippocampus. And so what we've shown is that with chronic stress, that hippocampus can actually shrink physically. Like it can literally get smaller. And we also observe that in chronic repeated depression. We also know that also some of the connections between various brain regions can get sort of messed up with chronic levels of stress. And then stress can also influence these other chemicals in our brain that kind of bathe it, that kind of serve to regulate how well the brain functions, how well the cells of the brain kind of crosstalk, but also vasculature. So one thing that we kind of forget about the brain is that there's so many blood vessels that, feed this amazing organ that we have. But stress can also dysregulate how well that vasculature kind of provides the blood and associated nutrients with, the requirements that we have when we're thinking. We need blood, et cetera, et cetera. So over the long term, basically stress, when it really goes unchecked, is not regulated and is coupled with, poor sleep and all these things, it takes a toll on our bodies and ultimately our brains as well. And I think, our bodies are kind of a good cue as to what may eventually occur in our mind, because we know if we're freaking out, constantly stressed out, not sleeping, we just have that blah feeling. Our bodies just don't feel great. So ultimately, that does translate to your brain. So that's sort of what stress does to the brain. Now, exercise seems to kind of dampen the effects of all that stress on the brain. Now, how it exactly does that and what intensity of exercise, those are sort of the questions that I'm interested in as a scientist. But generally speaking, any kind of exercise that's engaged in quite regularly, so that's kind of what I tend to study is, more regular forms of exercise, not just a simple bout of running, although that has its own short-term benefits. But longer-term exercise seems to have effects that kind of promote brain health, essentially. So if we go back to that little structure that I mentioned before, the hippocampus, which again is also used as a model to study, well, what happens with interventions. When we put rats in running wheels, where they're essentially given the opportunity to basically exercise as much as they want.
Yeah.
And because rats are totally bored, they love running wheels.
Yeah, they'll just run all day, right?
100%. So if we let them do that over a longer period of time, we actually see growth of cells in the hippocampus. And we see also increases in sort of neuron-loving molecules in the brain. We also see some restructuring of the brain vasculature. So the little vessels start to kind of proliferate with prolonged exercise. So it seems that longer-term exercise can have positive impacts on the brain, at least when we're studying certain structures. It's not, we don't take a brain scan before exercise and several weeks afterward and we see these pronounced changes. They're pretty subtle, but those subtle changes can actually be super, super important.
Right. So if you were exercising over a long term, let's say 6 months to a year, in that period, you might see some significant differences from the first brain scan to the next. And it's those differences that will end up making you less stressed out. Or could you potentially see some benefits just from before you exercised and after? Because I know sometimes I'll feel kind of stressed out and I'll work out. And then immediately after, I feel quite a bit better. What's going on there in the immediate, like within 30 minutes after exercising?
Right. So you're getting at like some really great questions. So you're kind of asking about like the runner's high that some people experience. So there are immediate benefits in that. We think that there's an endorphin release, which is essentially a molecule that typically just makes you feel good, but also an immediate downregulation of some of the stress hormones likely occurs as well. So some of them could also be physiological responses. So, I mean, our brains and bodies are super well connected, even though we pretend that they're not.
Yeah.
So if you kind of chill your body out, whether it's just kind of tire it out, have that endorphin going, then that also gives your brain a signal that things are pretty calm and chill and you should just, not be so stressed out. So there's kind of an immediate feedback that occurs that probably accounts for some of the positive effects of exercise in that more immediate term. And also just the notion of oxygenation. So even though our brain kind of protects itself from too much imbalances that occur in our body. I mean, more oxygen that you're taking in through something like exercise can also lead to more oxygen in the brain, even in the immediate sense or very shortly thereafter. The things that I was talking about, like kind of volumetric changes in certain structures, that definitely takes a longer period of time and just like restructuring of the brain in general. And I should also say there are a lot of kind of deviations from one person to the next, I guess. Right. So kind of like drugs. So we know that there's certain drugs, whether they're antidepressants or Tylenol or whatever, that work really well for some individuals in terms of alleviating their symptoms. But they don't work for everyone. And that could be a constellation of things, whether it's physical, genetic, environmental. I mean, we don't necessarily know. It's probably a combination of all those. I think the same can be said for exercise. So, I mean, one of the questions that I get asked is like, well, let's say you got a depressed individual to exercise, which in and of itself can actually be really, really challenging because one of the main kind of features of depression is a lack of motivation, right?
Yeah.
So like the best of us are like, well, I don't really feel like exercising after work. Well, couple that with depression, it can be really, really hard. So I think there might be something about like certain personality traits also, and maybe genetics and physiology, wherein maybe some individuals are kind of more responsive to the positive effects of exercise than others from sort of a well-being perspective. I think physiologically we can all, stand to gain from exercising a little bit more. But in terms of, what does it actually do to one's mental health? I think there is a little bit of variability when we need to consider all these other features.
Could part of the immediate benefits that I seem to feel and others seem to feel after exercising just be as simply as for the duration that you're exercising, your mind was kind of, you took your mind off of the problems that you're
100%.
You're usually dealing with.
100%.
Right.
I think you're absolutely right. And that's much more of a psychological element to it. Like, it's like if you are, running and kind of focusing on your breath, or whatever it is that you focus on when you're running. So typically for me, when I go for a run, I'm listening to a podcast, mainly to like kind of distract me from any discomfort. But I'm super present, I'm not really thinking about the grants I need to write or my students or, my cat or whatever it is.
Right.
You're totally right. Like our minds are focused in that particular moment. And I mean, I would kind of liken it to sort of anything that is sort of an activity that engages you. And I mean, other people might turn to something like music or art that when they're kind of performing that act, they're a little bit more focused. So I 100% agree with you that it could very well also be, just the fact that you're doing that and focusing on your body and not kind of thinking about all the stressors that kind of tend to activate, rumination or negative thinking. So you're totally right. Another thing that I just want to quickly add is the way we do the exercise interventions in our laboratory is that people actually have to come in. So one other aspect has been like the accountability piece as well,
right,
where people will say, well, you actually making me come in gives me a little bit of a schedule. And that in and of itself kind of takes me a little bit out of my funk because I know I have to leave the house.
right.
And even just like that act of preparedness and even coming sometimes can be sort of like a positive gesture in their own mind because they're like, okay, I'm not a total loser. At least I showed up.
Right.
So there's even just the element of like, okay, well, I'm actually just doing something too, right?
Right. Yeah. And once you show up, it's much harder to turn back around and get out of there to avoid the exercise.
That's exactly it.
Yeah. And I know at the beginning you mentioned that, so not all stress is bad and maybe stress in the short term, like acute stress can actually be beneficial to you, enhance your focus and attention. But over the long term, it's bad. And exercise itself can be considered a stress, right?
Right.
So could that potentially lead to issues if you're over exercising? Like you'll end up having some of the negative effects that you would have from any other chronic stress. And that kind of combined with that is there much of a difference between, from a neuroscience perspective, the stress that you get from exercise and the stress that you get from, let's say you're at work? Like if you were to scan the brain, is there any difference between the two stresses, or are they essentially the same, but it's a matter of like how long they last and how intense they are?
That is such a good question. I don't think I've thought about it deeply enough, to be perfectly honest. I think it would kind of have to depend on how much you're pushing yourself, physically, and kind of, I think, a little bit tied to your level of athleticism. So, I mean, I think just because the Olympics are kind of like, in our minds, one would have to imagine like their physical activity can be an immense stressor because it's sort of what they're doing. But these athletes are pushing themselves to like also crazy limits.
Yeah.
And so I can imagine that in those cases, part of the stressor of exercise becomes mental because, you're kind of chasing like milliseconds off of your mark, in addition to, just physical pain that some of them have to experience. So I think it would be really interesting to kind of comment or start studying, the effects of physical exercise in sort of elite athletes and seeing like what is that. And I think that might be a little bit different from the individuals that I tend to brush up against, because the people that I tend to brush up against are generally somewhat sedentary,
Right.
simply because we're trying to see, like, does exercise do anything to the brain and their mood? So we kind of have to start from a baseline that allows us to have some wiggle room to actually measure change.
Right.
And we try not to push them so much that,
Yeah.
they are super stressed out. At the same time, I think when you're sort of starting from a sort of a sedentary point of view, it's going to be kind of stressful no matter what. Because,
Right.
I mean,
Right.
as amazing as my grad students are, like, they're still there kind of observing these individuals and making sure that they're staying within a certain kind of a heart rate zone, because we want to be sort of looking at intensity and whatnot. So I do think that those initial intervention sessions are probably stressful for many different reasons.
Right.
I hope that they're pretty limited stress, and I hope that that balance between kind of like that good quote unquote stress and the stress that may be kind of peripheral to the whole circumstance or pushing oneself hopefully balances out quite quickly. But I don't know. I think what you're asking is a great question. Like, physical exertion is in and of itself a stressor, and how equivalent is it to like different stressors? I think there's probably some overlap
Yeah.
in terms of, you're going to get some sort of a cortisol response and whatnot, but I think there are probably some differences. And the reason I say that is because one of the biggest stressors that we can do is like a public speaking test, let's say. So you'd come into my lab and I would put on a lab coat and I would pretend that I'm evaluating you on your public speaking on a really random topic. And that's really stressful. And most people don't love it.
Yeah.
And I think there's probably more sustained stress responses after that than me saying, okay, you go on a treadmill and just go crazy. You might be super stressed out in that moment, but I think the recovery and like the mental kind of, I guess, percolation may be a little bit different. So I think there's probably similarities, but then there's probably some unique characteristics to that. And I think that's probably something I should study in my laboratory, because I think it's a very cool question. Yeah.
Yeah, like with the exercise, the stress might immediately end as soon as you stop exercising, but with the speech, you might go home and then you're ruminating about it and you're stressing about it even more.
Exactly.
Can our stress tolerance increase? And that's kind of why I was wondering about the exercise in comparison to other stresses, because could you potentially expand your stress tolerance by expanding your ability to handle exercise, and that would translate then over to everyday life? Like, as you progressed in, let's say, becoming a marathon runner and being able to stay on keep running after an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, could that then translate to your ability to continue studying or continue doing your work, even though prior to you engaging in the marathon activities at work, you would have wanted to call it quits earlier, but now your stress tolerance has increased and you can go longer and further. Basically in summary, can our stress tolerance increase, and do you think that could be a way to improve our ability to handle everyday stress is by adding exercise in our life?
Yeah. That's a really cool way of looking at it. I don't know if I've ever sort of thought about the link between, exercise and kind of stress resilience as a pathway. So to answer your question, maybe not directly to the exercise piece, yes, I think we all as humans have the capacity to become more resilient to stress or more stress tolerant. And I actually think and it's probably like a totally separate discussion, but it's something that I think we need to learn better as a society and teach maybe our teens a little bit. I think there's a lot of pressure that's exerted on our youth, and I don't necessarily think that they're taught the proper coping skills to deal with some of these stressors, and ultimately maybe more susceptible to kind of crumbling when there's something bigger in life that occurs and developing mental health issues. So the notion of resilience and how we best kind of build it is something that's discussed more and more in psychiatry and has probably been missing. So essentially that kind of speaks to the idea of like almost prevention of serious mental health issues by equipping our kids and our teens with more strategies to kind of cope with the pressures of life, which, you know, we kind of said at the very beginning, like they're really not going away. You turn on any device, you go outside, and it is divisive politics, it's climate change, it's COVID, like you name it.
Yeah.
And it's really kind of easy to crumble under all of that. So I guess how do we link that to exercise? I mean, I've always kind of thought about it more from a neuroscience perspective in that, you know, with exercise, your brain can become a little bit more adaptive and plastic.
Right.
And so if you have a healthier brain, presumably it can cope a little bit with stress a bit better. But I really also love what you're saying in that, okay, let's say we engage in exercise, we're also learning so many other kind of coping strategies. And as you said, like, okay, if we're working towards a marathon, for instance, well, that's going to require a certain amount of work. That's not going to happen overnight.
Yeah.
And it's also going to, you know, involve some degree of disappointment and kind of crummy days. Like we all know that, like some days that run is a lot easier than others. And you're like, I don't even understand what happened. Like, is it that one extra coffee?
Yeah.
But I wonder if through learning, like, you know, the tools of like resilience through kind of more of a physical lens that then translates to other aspects, I would probably say yes. And I know that there's work on athletes where, you know, they do a lot of endurance training and psychological techniques because we know of the link between mind and body. But I guess I've fixated a little bit more on the like kind of brain health perspective and the ability for the brain to kind of absorb more versus thinking about, you know, the strategies that one also accumulates with exercise that kind of have not as much to do with the brain directly. I think that's an excellent point. And yeah, that's probably exactly what is going on as well.
Right. Yeah, I really like that idea of being able to develop your resilience and tolerance through exercise, and especially through the lens of helping with anxiety, because I could see how that might benefit. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on this too. But exercise, a lot of the sensations that you're going to feel while you're exercising are similar to the sensations that bother people when they're anxious, such as sweating or trembling or like a flushed face or overheating. And I would think that maybe if you get accustomed and very used to feeling those sensations when you're exercising all the time, in the moments where you're, let's say, public speaking and you start to feel sweating or you start to feel your body heating up, you are more used to that. You know there's no reason to necessarily panic. You can handle these sensations. And also, I know for anxiety, one of the main problems that people run into with it is a tendency to avoid the situations that cause them anxiety or to retreat. And obviously, they're going to avoid or retreat at the moment when they feel an overwhelming sensation of anxiety. And if we were able to push that level of anxiety higher and higher and higher to the point where they're not going to retreat until it's much higher than it was before, then you effectively make them less anxious. And if you can push that boundary by doing other things like exercise, that would be pretty interesting. I mean, I don't know if that's something that we even know or if that's how it works at all, but interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I really like that. So you're totally right. Something like a panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, which is super, super prevalent, has a lot of links with like the symptoms you experience, or symptoms, whatever, the features you experience when you're exercising, like shortness of breath, sweating, all of that stuff. Now, I don't know about a direct link, but certainly I think it would be really cool to start asking our participants whether they've even made that mental connection of, okay, when you're in sort of an anxiety provoking situation, have you ever thought about, okay, like I'm sweating a little bit, but that's okay. I've sweated in different circumstances and it was no big deal, or whether that's completely subconscious, and it could be. And I think there probably is something to that. We certainly see that anxiety levels do go down with individuals who incorporate exercise as like kind of a mental wellness tool over time.
Right.
And could that be, because your body is subconsciously being kind of trained to deal with these natural triggers that also occur when you're experiencing like sort of a panic episode? And I think there definitely is a link. And I think maybe where I can speak perhaps a little bit more directly to it is something like psychotherapy and things like exposure therapy. So let's say you have a phobia of, who knows, snakes, flying, just pick your poison.
Yeah.
And, that therapy is very tailored to actually exposing an individual to a trigger. And you try to do it safely. You don't take out your, python right away, but like you'll show a picture or whatever.
Right.
And the therapist really tries to guide the individual within the discomfort. So, I mean, they'll want to look away. They might start panting. And it's sort of retraining your body and your brain not to have that really intense physiological kind of arousing effect.
Right.
So I think, we already employ those techniques of like sort of attempting to dampen those sort of fight responses. And I do think that exercise probably has intersectionality in that if you're kind of experiencing those symptoms in the context of exercise and able to kind of push those limits a little bit more every single time, or just understand that, this is just our body's response, perhaps that then translates to a more calm physiological state that you can kind of maybe buffer a little bit more or manage as a result of the exercise. I think it's really difficult to kind of prove directly, but it certainly seems like it would be a kind of an intuitive link, and I love that.
Yeah, it seems like combining exercise with some psychotherapy or exposure therapy, as you're describing, could really be a brilliant combination, because it seems like for that exposure therapy, part of what's going on is you're trying to teach the person who's dealing with the fear that this actually is safe. This isn't anything to be worried about. And in that context, it's a learning environment. Yeah. The person's gradually learning that, okay, I don't actually need to be afraid. And I know that, and I want to get into this with you later, that exercise is very beneficial for our learning and improving our ability to learn. So if you improve your ability to learn and then you combine it with that learning environment and then all the other benefits that exercise provides to anxiety along with it, it seems like a great recipe for trying to help people overcome their anxiety. And I'm curious, is there any difference? What's the difference between stress and anxiety? Because they often seem very, very similar from like a neuroscience perspective. What is the difference there?
So I mean, they kind of are used interchangeably in like a lot of media and kind of day-to-day like vocab. I mean, anxiety is a clinical term. So we have these kind of psychological guides that allow us to say, okay, you have some sort of an anxiety disorder, for instance. Stress is more of a physiological term.
Right.
So I guess if I were to make a division between the two, I would say, well, one's a disorder and one's kind of a reaction. But you can have kind of a stressed / anxious response almost interchangeably. At least that's the way it's known. But if we're going to get kind of nitty gritty, I would say, well, anxiety, or especially like generalized anxiety disorder, you need to meet certain criteria in order to actually have that as a diagnosis.
Right.
And a stress can kind of occur at any point. So, you getting into a car accident can be a stressor and you have a stress response. That doesn't mean you have anxiety. Now, down the road, thinking about that might give you anxiety, but the trigger itself causes sort of a stress response. So maybe it might be helpful to think of stressor as a little bit more of a biological concept and anxiety as more of a psychological construct. But I think it's a really blurred boundary, and certainly I think in day to day they kind of are interchangeable. In the concept of psychiatry, one is used to actually describe a disorder, i.e. anxiety.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I want to switch over to depression, because I know that's something that is a widely issue in the general public, and it'd be amazing to be able to find some solutions to that, because like anxiety, I think depression also can have massive effects on your life and really hinder your ability to fully express yourself out in the world. It seems almost though depression can be it's like you're carrying weights around and you're unable to really bring your true self out. And so if we're able to have anything that could have a positive effect on it, that'd be amazing. And is exercise one of those things that could help treat depression? And how does it work as far as treating it?
Yeah, so yes, I think it can is kind of the short answer. Although I don't think it's like a panacea, and I don't think it's going to work necessarily for everyone. So, I mean, there's a lot of kind of crosstalk between anxiety and depression. So people who are depressed tend to also experience anxiety. People who are predominantly anxious might be more likely to also experience depression. So generally we see an overlap of about 50%. So let's say you have a diagnosis of depression, you're pretty likely to have a diagnosis of anxiety.
Right.
So the lines are quite blurred. But I think another thing that's probably important to mention is not all depression looks the same for everyone, which is why I think I kind of loop back to the notion that exercise might not be kind of a cure-all for all types of depression as well. So some people, really experience depression in a way that's more physical, for instance. So they'll have sleeping disturbances, they'll have eating disturbances, they might be quite jittery, they might not be able to concentrate. And then, those kind of dark thoughts are a little bit secondary to a lot of the physical ones. It's not super typical. It's usually a mixed bag of everything. So there are some theories that maybe exercise might be better for those individuals that experience those physical symptoms more so than the ones who are purely ruminating, for instance.
Right.
But it's kind of one of those aspects that we're trying to see, does exercise seem to kind of alleviate some symptoms more than others of depression? I don't think we'll really be able to answer that in my study because it's not going to be a big enough sample size, but I'm hoping that it might steer us sort of in the right direction.
Right.
But let's say we just accept that it's kind of beneficial to all people with depression, no matter really what their symptomatology is like, which again, I don't necessarily think that's the case, but I do think in general, it can have positive effects, and those positive effects could be brain-based, as I mentioned, but it could also be those positive effects that really kind of latch onto the notion of having a certain degree of self-agency as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the people that gravitate towards exercise as a possible intervention are the ones that would like to try certain things that aren't just medication for various reasons. And I think, medication works and is perfectly valid and life-saving for a lot of folks.
Yeah.
But there's a cohort that don't necessarily want to start there, or they've taken medication in the past and they didn't love the side effects. So they're trying to see what else they can do in order to improve their symptoms of depression. And I think some of it really comes from the idea of like, this is actually something I have control over,
Right.
versus, oftentimes in mental illness, you feel like you really lose control of your own emotions.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that piece may have quite a bit to do with it. Some people also experience, the benefits of exercise from a physiological perspective. So we kind of know that when you exercise your body, your sleep kind of gets a little bit better, or maybe your eating patterns get a little bit more normalized.
Right.
And so when you kind of take care of your health a little bit more, then those psychological feelings might get a little bit more manageable. And it kind of harkens back to the notion of like, typically when you present at a doctor's office and you're doing not so great, a doctor or a therapist may be like, well, how's your sleep? How's your eating? And sometimes we forget about those very basic facts. Those are a foundation for a healthy mind and healthy brain as well. So perhaps exercise, in addition to, maybe changing the brain and all those other factors, simply kind of gets some of those more basic biological needs under control. And then it almost like gives the patient a bit more space to deal with some of the more like kind of mental dark spaces, because they're no longer so stressed about, oh my goodness, I'm like so underslept. So that's a super convoluted answer as to how I think exercise may play a role in the context of depression. And I just don't think it's a unitary phenomenon. I think it can play a role in so many different ways.
Right. Yeah, that's very interesting that it could play a role just simply as you start exercising and then other areas of your life kind of fall into place better. You're going to be you're going to be more tired when it's time to go to bed. Maybe you want to eat healthier because you've been working out. I find that's something for me that usually goes hand in hand, is whenever I fall off the exercise, usually I start eating way worse. And I don't know why. I just don't have the desire to eat as healthy when I'm not working out. But as far as if you were to do like a neuroimaging on a depressed individual, what differences do you see in their brain compared to somebody who doesn't have any depression? Or is it not as simple as that, where you're going to see like something clear on the image?
No, I wish it were kind of like a diagnostic test, like let's say there's something wrong with your liver or your heart, you can get, a blood test or like a brain or a heart monitoring exam and can reveal that. That's really not the case with mental illness. So I always have to say that to my patients. It's like, I will scan your brain, but I will not visually see anything different. No. So generally the way we do these studies is, we need, unfortunately, quite a lot of data, and we tend to pool individuals into the depressed versus the non-depressed group, which ultimately, is it was a starting point. It's something we're hoping to get away from, but there is so much variability in one's brain that we kind of need pretty big numbers of folks with depression versus without depression in order to tease out what the brain differences are. Now, there are some things that we do see in the brain, despite the caveats, despite saying, okay, there's all these exceptions. And that tends to be generally an overactivation of the amygdala. So the amygdala is sort of the structure that is very highly involved in fear processing. So it does kind of light up when, stress is sort of on board. And there does seem to be sort of overactivation of that structure in certain types of tasks, and sometimes even at rest, suggesting that sort of even at baseline, that particular region that's meant to be involved in stress may be hyperactive. Another aspect that we see is kind of increased connection within this brain network called the default mode network, which is sort of a network that tends to be activated when we're ruminating. So it does seem to suggest that folks with depression tend to engage brain networks a little bit differently than folks without depression when we're kind of just asking them not to do anything and we're scanning their brain. Occasionally, we do also see decreases in that volume of the hippocampus in depressed folks, especially those ones that have had multiple episodes of depression. And that's probably, one way of answering your question is generally we see more pronounced brain changes in people that have had depression for longer. Right. And have had numerous incidences of depression. It seems like the kind of scarring of the brain tends to be a little bit cumulative with multiple episodes and really severe episodes as well, which always kind of gives me hope, though, that, if somebody's had one depressive episode, then we know that if we can intervene and perhaps equip individuals with treatment or treatment strategies, we can kind of prevent somebody from spiraling into a really severe depressive episodes, because we do know that ultimately there can be almost, I don't want to say brain damage that we can't change. It's just a rewiring of the brain that might be kind of difficult to change over time in folks that really suffer from depression over and over and over again.
Right. So there can be some improvements through interventions where they've had deterioration in their brain in certain areas from the depression, but with interventions like exercise or does medication help with that as well? Or,
it does. Yeah, exactly. So again, a lot of the work has been on that structure called the hippocampus. Again, because it's just a model where we can capture change the most. So we know that with exercise, you can actually increase the volume of that particular structure, and you can increase how many cells there are. You see the same thing with like pharmacotherapy. So like drugs like Prozac, if you administer them over the longer period, that can also kind of increase the volume of that structure as a result of pharmacotherapy. We've also seen it with ketamine administration. So ketamine is sort of this new drug. It's an anesthetic. It's actually been around for a really long time. But when you give it at sub-anesthetic doses to people who are highly suicidal, highly depressed, it can actually have pretty profound mood elevating effects. And so some of the work has been showing that ketamine can also do the same thing. So it seems like there is a synergy, despite different mechanisms of action, that they can kind of all culminate in kind of comparable brain changes.
Right.
And most of it is kind of over a longer period of time. So we don't yet have the capacity to capture brain changes, especially from neuroimaging, on a short scale. So if let's say I gave you a drug and you came in the next day, I probably wouldn't be able to capture anything very precisely. But over a longer term, I might be able to. Now, there are other ways we can study the brain, and one of the ways I do so is through EEG, which looks at brain electrical activity, and that seems to be actually a lot more sensitive to short-term changes. So if I give you a drug and I look at your brain electrical activity, the waves that are generated can actually be changed quite quickly, and that can be super informative. And in fact, it's used a lot in drug trial development, and even looking at the effects of meditation on the brain. So can we change brain waves, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, we can see some changes, but boy, they can be pretty difficult to just pick out in one individual.
Yeah, it sounds like trying to solve the problem of depression is very high level problem solving, and there's so many variables at play there, which I guess is why you like it. It's such a complex problem to sort out, and like you said, it's not a one size fits all situation. So for who would then be the type of person where you'd be more likely to prescribe exercise to them versus some antidepressants? Is it just as simple as they're willing to do it and they want to do it?
I love that question, and I do not know. Like, that actually is as part of my larger kind of goal, is to see like what constitutes an individual who is most likely to respond to exercise as a form of kind of an antidepressant intervention than somebody else.
Right.
I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. Right now, we're starting from the point of, are you kind of motivated? Because I can't even study somebody to see what happens to their brain, with exercise if they don't even do it, right? Like if somebody has no interest, then there's really no starting point there. So it's also kind of a criticism of the work, right? Because I can't really do it in this perfectly scientific manner because there's a self-selection bias there. Like, who enrolls in my trials? Well, people who are okay with the thought of exercise as an intervention, right? If you totally don't believe in it, you're not going to enroll, or if you're not even remotely close to motivated to do it.
Right.
So I think there's probably going to be some personality traits that I think we will be able to see at least, is a certain personality type overrepresented in the individuals that might do well. Like maybe they're, I don't know, more open to experiences, or perhaps maybe I don't know. It's all kind of speculative right now. It's such a good question. Though I do think a starting point right now has to be at least some degree of openness to coming in and exercising, because otherwise it's just not going to happen. Exactly.
And I've heard that actually exercise can be as effective as a treatment for depression as medication. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. But also, obviously, there's a barrier to getting the benefits of exercise, is the effort and the exertion that it takes to actually get out there and exercise, versus the medication is a little bit more simple of a process. So is that true that exercise can be as effective for obviously the people who end up following through with it?
Yeah, so I think it can be, but the kind of asterisks I will say is, we're not studying all depressed folks. Again, we're kind of studying these like kind of self-selected folks who probably have some belief that this might help. And it's really difficult to have kind of a comparison group, because like you can't really blind somebody to an exercise intervention. Like, in proper drug trials, you give somebody a fake sugar pill and somebody a proper pill, and then you do a comparison, and the person doesn't know, and neither does the scientist or whomever is running the trial who has what. And so we know the power of the placebo effect. Like, even me giving you a sugar pill generally has a pretty good response, period, which is why it's actually difficult to have drug trials sort of attain the criterion that they need to in order to show that they're actually effective, because you're not comparing against anything. You're comparing against something that looks like a pill, tastes like a pill, but doesn't have those active ingredients. With exercise, I can't do that, right? No. Like, it's like you have to exercise or you're not exercising. So how we're sort of getting around it is, my main question is really about whether intensity matters. So we're pushing people at a higher intensity versus a moderate intensity and seeing, doesn't matter. Like, or is exercise that's kind of pretty decent cardio exertion all good, and you don't need to be going crazy hard. So that's kind of the one question that we're trying to answer. And that allows us kind of a comparison process. Other studies have kind of done, comparisons with like yoga. So there's still a physical element. You're still coming in, but there isn't that aerobic component where you're actually working the musculature quite hard.
Right.
So then it's kind of a more fair comparison. But I guess the reason that I think the people who are studied with exercise do better is sort of the reason that I think people with psychotherapy can also do better. So I think
Mm-hmm.
if you're at a place where you're sufficiently, I guess, receptive to the possibility of help, and
Yeah.
if it's a good fit for you, you will probably get better. And people with something like cognitive behavioral therapy also get better.
Right.
And you know, that's also kind of a process that involves you going to see a therapist, committing to it, doing your homework, et cetera, et cetera. So I again think that there's probably a match between the people that respond to different interventions than others. Now, I think for people who are very severely depressed in particular,
Mm-hmm.
you know, we need to get them to some sort of a baseline where they might benefit from exercise or therapy, and medication may be what's required to get them to baseline. So I think another kind of great possibility is kind of seeing whether adding on exercise to people who are already medicated versus not, whether that changes anything. You know, does that then sustain the antidepressant effects? Does
Mm-hmm.
it maybe increase quality of life in the longer term? Because some of the things that we sometimes find is like, we'll give folks medication, they'll do well, but then if we take them off, you know, they might relapse, or perhaps like the long-term effects are not as great as we want. And I think looking at exercise sort of as an add-on for folks might be a really good way to go, kind of in the longer term. Yeah.
Right. You had mentioned that part of the problem with depressed individuals is that they have a lack of motivation. For the youth that you're working with that are depressed, what are some of the like motivation tactics you use to try to get them to be more motivated? Obviously, you said just having them show up at the
Yeah.
location helps.
Yeah.
Are there any other like tools or things that even anybody listening or myself could try to implement to
Yeah.
make us a little more motivated? Because
Yeah.
I feel like I'm only like really want to exercise maybe
Yeah.
like 10-15% of the time.
Yeah.
It's hard to really get going sometimes.
And look, that's so fair. I think we also have to be like super gentle on ourselves, because like we're super busy. Trying to, you know, squeeze in exercise is really, really hard. So it's kind of I'll give you a two-part answer. So for our participants, we're kind of on them. We're kind of annoying.
Yeah.
And you know, that I think ensures that they come in. So I mean, we're there kind of texting and phoning and emailing and scheduling these sessions. And again, I think that accountability piece really helps, because then you're sort of offloading that burden onto somebody else. So my grad student will be like, okay, here's your session. You gave me your school schedule. You gave me your work schedule. This is what works. So somebody's kind of done the homework
Yeah.
for you of ensuring that like we have now carved out this time. You're committed to the study. I mean,
Right.
there's kind of other benefits in that, you know, they get to see occasionally like a counselor or one of our clinical research staff, so that we're doing kind of regular mood check-ins as well. So I think those are kind of bigger motivators. You know, we allow them to pick whatever equipment they want. I think flexibility in how they exercise is also pretty darn important. So
Right.
we're not prescriptive. Like, I don't tell people just to run. If they don't want to run, I don't care. So
Yeah.
long as they do their exercise within a specific heart rate range, essentially. So we want their hearts beating, you know, at whatever level that we had decided on. And I think that also helps. And I mean, it's kind of interesting. I just actually had a chat with my grad student, because she said one individual has a really hard time getting into that rhythm of the exercise after the weekend. And
Right.
that's kind of interesting, because we were sort of identifying a pattern that, like, for this one particular individual, taking a break of more than 3-4 days, that's an identified challenge that we're like, okay, so we might need to maybe do a weekend session so that there never really is more than a handful of days, because for her, that seems to be a little bit of an obstacle to get into that proper heart rate zone. And she kind of struggles. But then the rest of the week, she's kind of fine because the gap isn't so long. So I think another answer to that question is to personalize it to a certain extent. Yeah. So you're kind of working with a person's schedule. You're kind of working within their abilities. I think that's super, super helpful. And then, how can we kind of extract that to our own situations? I think, again, that's also very personal. I think what works for one person doesn't necessarily need to work for another person. And so we have to kind of refrain from being too judgy. But there are things that we kind of know that work. And accountability is one of them. So for some people, when you know that you're going with a buddy, you're more likely to go. For other people, that's just an added stressor and that doesn't work. Like, for instance, I can't exercise with anyone because I find that I go at really weird times. Like, I like to take a run at 10 p.m. I don't think anyone wants to go for a run at that point. And it's kind of like my time, right? So I've sort of identified that within me. But somebody might be totally different. And they're like, no, I always need to go to a gym. Like, my brother's a good example where he's like, that's how I do it. That's how I like it.
Right.
I think also integrating exercise as much as possible within our lives makes exercising so much easier. And I think, modern society doesn't aid with that particularly well. Like, you rewind maybe 60 years ago, like, you kind of had to walk a little bit more. You kind of had to do more manual stuff because we didn't have as many things at our fingertips. Like, you still had to go to a store, while here we're just like, well, we're just gonna order something online. So I think, having strategies where it isn't necessarily carved out exercise time may be helpful for some folks who are already struggling kind of fitting in, other things in their lives. So taking those stairs, going for that walk to the corner store or whatever, I think that is really, really, really useful. Just moving more in general is useful, and just not being so harsh. So, if you didn't get those 3 runs in per week, like, who cares? Did you get in 1 run? Great. Let's move on. And that kind of harkens back to not being so judgy with yourself. But that I think is kind of something we all struggle with. So those are always my tips. Like, recognize what works for you. Try to keep to that, but also don't beat yourself up if it didn't work that week, and make it easier on yourself. Like, just incorporate it into your day to day. So another good strategy is, let's say, that after work or after school, you're kind of unlikely to exercise. Well, take your gym bag and, like, don't give yourself as much of an excuse. Like, make your life easier.
Yeah. Kind of integrate it into your schedule.
Exactly.
And what do you think about the idea of almost treating it like some other mandatory thing that you do, like taking a shower every day? You try to consider exercise as something that's more of what you need to do versus an additional extracurricular or like a fun item. I know you mentioned you don't want to be too harsh on yourself, but do you think that would be a good thing for people to try to implement, to say, this is just what I do. I exercise 5 times a week, or I exercise 3 times, whatever it is. Yeah. And it's just in my schedule, and I just get it done regardless.
Yeah. I mean, I think it would be, but I also don't want to impose that on anyone. Right, yeah. But having said that, that's kind of what we're trying to do with the exercise interventions. So, I mean, we get these teens to come in 3 times per week for 12 weeks. Mm-hmm. Now, I have no control as to what happens when they're done with the study. And, we've sort of looked at their brain before and after. But I hope that they're kind of developing some sort of a habit where, okay, we've made it super kind of annoying for you. You have to come to this gym. We're watching you. You have these monitors. But hopefully you can see that as just being something that you do in life. And especially for the youth that see the benefits, like the ones that feel better, hopefully they just kind of continue to integrate that. And, anecdotally, with many of the patients that I interact with, they will say, Yeah, exercise generally does make me feel better, but, and there's always a dot, dot, dot,
Yeah.
because life gets busy. And I
Uh-huh.
get it. I totally get it. Life is completely busy.
Yeah.
So I think, integrating it in a more rigorous way can be a really great strategy for most. But I don't want to be too like prescriptive and say that's what everybody should do, because sometimes that's just an additional stressor. But I think if you can build it in, and it
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily need to be super long, I think that's an easier way just to kind of have it be part of your life. And whether you kind of believe me as a neuroscientist, I think anyone can just say like moving more is, I don't think it's ever going to hurt anyone.
No.
Like
Yeah.
there's really not a downside to it. You generally feel a little bit better, you metabolize a little bit better, you sleep a
Yeah.
little bit better. So I would really look to the individual who says, no, that's just, there's no benefits. And I mean, we also have to think about people with disabilities and kind of what works best for them. So,
Right.
so those are definitely, I think, bigger conversations to be had. How do we kind of accommodate physical exercise from maybe the people who are not as able-bodied as others? But I think there's, wonderful individuals who are doing great creative work in that respect. And people
Right.
with physical disabilities, and we see it in the Olympics that overcome physical and mental limitations as well. But we need to support those folks.
Right. And like you said about the people's lives get extremely busy, and there's comes a time where they need to cut some things out of their schedule, and often exercise is one of the first things. But do you think that if you were to implement exercise, you may end up getting more out of your day and end up having a more efficient day because of the improvements in reduction in stress, anxiety, depression, improvements in learning? So by actually taking that 30 minutes out of your day to exercise, the net result of what you got out of the day could, in theory, be more. Does that make sense, or that's a bit of an idealistic thing to be
No,
thinking?
I think that makes so much sense. I think the barrier we all kind of bump up against is like it still requires work. And I think people in general, and this is sort of like a psychological phenomenon, we're not great at long-term kind of mental visualizations. We're better in the immediate. So, which is kind of why we make some crummy decisions, right? Like,
Yeah.
I know over the long term that me going to therapy, getting good sleep, getting exercise is better for my life, period.
Yeah.
But when I'm feeling lazy, you tend not to think about kind of the long term. You think about the immediate. So it's like, no, immediately right now, I just feel like watching some like trashy TV because I've had a really bad day.
Right, yeah.
And that's the decision that I made, right? So it's sort of trying to reorient our sort of thinking about the long-term effects, or sort of, as you said, just it's a habit. It becomes kind of like a day-to-day thing. And then you just don't think about cutting it because it's like, no, I did it yesterday. I'll do it again today. Just kind of like brushing my teeth, right? I mean, the problem really does become in certain severe forms of mental illness where, people with severe depression can't even brush their teeth. Like,
Right.
where hygiene actually does become, a symptom of the disorder. And then it's really severe and we sort of have to think about other ways. But if we're talking about, just a normal folk that isn't, in this very severe depressed state, I think there really is something to be said for like the routine and for some individuals thinking about like, okay, but in the long term, this is really good for me. And even if I give it 5 minutes, well, that's better than me not doing anything for 5 minutes. So kind of training ourselves to think about the benefits versus, oh, this is just such a pain in the ass,
Right. Yeah. Because ideally you'd be exercising over the long term. Maybe it's a lifetime thing, but to consider that for some people might be a daunting thing.
Exactly.
To have to get up day after day for the rest of your life every year. Did you find with the youth that that were depressed that you were doing research on and trying to help out, that as the time went on, they actually became more motivated? Because doesn't exercise help with motivation?
Yeah, so it kind of, that's a really good question. I think it sort of depended on the person a little bit. So
Uh-huh.
what you end up seeing in these like relatively sedentary youth is initially they kind of struggle because their bodies are just not used to working out like that.
Right.
But then after a couple of weeks they get into it, and we push them a little bit more each time, so we get them to exercise a little bit harder in order to keep their heart rate within the zone that we need to. So when you first started out, you probably could go for 3 minutes and you attain that zone really quickly, and then when your cardiovascular health improves, it takes longer. So we do push them, but because we're trying to look at an intensity, we actually don't want some of them to go faster or harder. And you can see that they get kind of annoyed because they're like, but I could totally do this much more.
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, that's great, but that's, I'm trying to answer a scientific question, which they don't care about, which is fair, but I have to kind of keep them on
Yeah.
track. So you do see some people really wanting to push themselves. For some others, actually, there's been just some bodily changes. They kind of like being a little bit trimmer.
Right.
So that is a kind of an added motivator. For some, you do actually get a petering out. So it's generally, once we kind of get buy-in at the beginning, the vast majority stick around, but others don't. And you do see dropouts pretty quickly. I would say within the first month is where we see a dropout. And I think, I'm not sure if that has so much to do with exercise or whether it has more to do with like the actual commitment. Like when you actually, it's kind of like therapy. Once you start therapy, you're like, oh, now I need to do it, and this is a lot of work.
Yeah.
I think some of it is the same thing where people are like, oh, okay, I need to come here 3 times per week. Whoa, that's, like we kind of get them to think about their schedule and anticipate that commitment. So I'm not sure if it's so much just the physicality of it, or like, ooh, it actually just takes some time, so people drop out. So generally we see increases in motivation because we've kind of vetted the people as much as we possibly could and try to mentally prepare them, like, if you're going to enroll, we really do want you to stick around, because otherwise it's kind of a waste of time for you and for us. But there are a handful that just can't stick with it. And it's kind of hard to say why.
Yeah, it is really interesting though to think about ways we can try to motivate people, because you even brought up some more examples of benefits from exercise, which is just physically getting fitter. And when I think about like the wide array of things that exercise affects, it's really is incredible. Like all these mental benefits that we've been talking about, and that's aside from the typical physical benefits that people think of when they're thinking about physical activity, improvements to your heart, your lungs, gaining muscle, losing body fat.
Yeah.
And that's all in combination with the mental benefits. And maybe just, at least for me, learning about this has been a motivational factor. Just knowing, oh, wow, I'm not just doing this to get physically more fit. This has incredible improvements on my brain. And one thing that I really like about focusing on the brain versus the body when thinking about exercise is that sometimes when you're considering the body, the results you're looking for don't come very quickly. But with the brain, it can be pretty much immediate. Like afterwards, I feel less stressed. Maybe I feel a little bit better focus. And yeah, it's just the array of benefits is amazing. For the youth that you were working with, what age ranges are they, and is there like a significant difference between their brains and, let's say, just a fully developed adult?
So that's such a good question, because like, why am I focused on youth? So we study 16 to 24 year olds. But realistically, I generally work with a university or college aged population, or a cégep if for the Quebec folks.
Right.
So it's probably more 18 to 24.
Okay.
Now, the reason I'm super interested in youth is actually because we do know that their brains continue to develop until probably the age of around 24, 25, and specifically the prefrontal cortex, so the frontal brain region sort of just underneath your forehead. That's the area that continues to develop into the mid-20s. It's also an area that's super important in like cognition and inhibition of like impulses, but also like emotional regulation. So I guess the reason I'm most interested in youth is because I actually think that interventions have like a greater capacity to interact with their brain development in order to produce longer lasting changes. Like, I think we have a better shot at reshaping or shaping the brain in like teens and youth than we do with somebody's brain who's more or less formed. Now, we always learn, so our brains are always sort of, creating new connections and whatnot, even until we're really old. But it really does kind of continue into those mid-20s, which is why I'm specifically focused on this population, because that prefrontal cortical region really kind of reshapes itself quite extensively during that time. But also, up until the age of about 18, 19, 20, the emotional centers also keep on getting tweaked. And it's really the communication between the emotional centers and those like cognitive centers that continue to be refined as well. So it's the notion of, okay, your brain continues to develop. Let's try an intervention that we know changes the brain. And then could we lay a foundation for more permanent change going forward that might equip you with a brain that's more resilient? So that's why I study youth. I actually find them the most hopeful. From a neuroscience perspective in some ways. But also like they're compliant, right? So I'm not working with kids where you need to like pull them out of school and work with their parents. So teens are a population where like they're kind of just in between adulthood and childhood, where from sort of a society perspective we can kind of intervene in a way that's sort of independent of like parents, but their brains are so darn pliable. But they're also going through so many stressors, right? Like they tend to be in university, they're trying to figure out relationships. Like there's a lot of like social factors and societal factors that also can be triggers for mental health issues. So that's why I focus on them.
So prior to the age 25, the brain is a little bit more pliable and it has more room for development.
That's right.
Yeah, because I've heard that before, that the brain only finishes fully developing at 25. And I think about that from time to time, just because right now I'm 24 and my birthday's in a couple months. How hard is this deadline where like...
No, it's not a hard deadline. It's all good. We're always pushing it. I'm pushing my brain as much as possible. So, it's an average. It's not, there it goes. That 25th birthday, you're hooped. So no. Let's not get too stressed out by that. There's always room for growth. But if we look kind of at teens on average, and we look at these like big consortia that look at, many brain-based studies. I mean, that's just kind of how we tend to plot these things, that there seems to be a little bit of a leveling off after the age of 25 when it comes to those frontal brain regions.
But the brain still can develop. It's not like maybe we once thought, in at least from what I heard in the science community, is that the brain kind of, it is what it is, and you can't necessarily make too many changes. But we now know that a lot can change.
Sure.
How does exercise come into play related to the ability to change your brain? And I hear every now and then when it comes to changing the brain, the term neuroplasticity.
Yeah.
So do you think you could explain what that means, neuroplasticity?
Sure.
And how exercise influences it?
Sure. So in like the simplest term, the concept of neuroplasticity is just our brain's ability to change. And I mean, change can mean a lot of different things, but if we kind of zoom in to brain cells, which are neurons, there's connections between every single neuron. So one neuron talks with another neuron, and they all talk to each other. They're connected in just, this crazy spider web within our brain. And the notion of neuroplasticity is simply modifying those connections. So strengthening them, weakening them. Now, the extent of those changes are a heck of a lot more prevalent as we're kids. So there's all these expansions and actually a lot of pruning of these neuronal connections, because you kind of start out with this kind of big mess and eventually you kind of refine it. So what actually occurs is a lot of death of synapses, which sounds horrible, but it's actually not a terrible thing, because it allows your brain to be a lot more efficient.
Right.
But with that, you also learn with more difficulty, because that flexibility that once was in terms of all those connections isn't there. It's a little bit more entrenched. Right. So as an adult, you need to kind of work harder in order to change some of those connections.
Right.
So that's sort of what the notion of neuroplasticity is. Now, there's certain things within our brain that promote or hinder that neuroplasticity.
Yeah.
So one kind of class of neurochemicals that promoted would be something called the neurotrophins. So they're just basically molecules that allow for the physical reconfiguration of those connections. And generally, it's not necessarily more is better, but there's a different balance of them. And exercise can kind of switch the balance in the favor of those more neuron-loving molecules that essentially create an environment that's a little bit more conducive to neuroplasticity.
Right.
So, and medication is kind of thought to do sort of the same thing, and also learning, like it's if you learn something, you're kind of reworking some of those connections. But exercise is thought to create an environment that just allows your brain to be a little bit more receptive to learning, because of the things we kind of discussed about those neuron loving molecules, more oxygen coming into your brain, and perhaps differences in vasculature as well. They're probably pretty darn subtle. We can't see them easily, but that's kind of the theory as to why exercise might promote neuroplasticity.
Right. Okay. So if exercise provides a better environment for neuroplasticity and learning, is it providing that immediately after you work out, or is this just something that's over a long term? You might see some benefits. So
I think there's probably some really immediate things that occur. So you would probably get a change in neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters are the chemicals that communicate between our brain cells, and those can be changed quite quickly based on environment. So you could get some kind of immediate modulation, or even a dampening of other circulating hormones that do or do not get into your brain, that can kind of change how the brain functions, and that's pretty immediate. And then the longer term consequences would actually occur with that more sort of reconfiguration or rewiring of the brain that takes just a longer amount of time, because we're actually talking about like sort of building new neuronal connections, and those don't occur as quickly as some of the more immediate kind of chemical changes. So I think we're kind of talking about two slightly different aspects in terms of kind of pathways of learning. So, I mean, you can get that runner's high, and that might kind of give you a certain level of clear-headedness, because perhaps like the stress hormones are a little bit down and you can kind of focus a little bit more. But for like kind of longer term benefits where you actually physically rewire your brain, that just naturally will take a longer period of time. And I kind of liken it to like, if you break a bone, there's going to be some pretty immediate effects that occur right away in your body. So there's going to be certain cells that get there that fight, whatever vasculature might be broken and whatever fracture there might be. So it's a pretty immediate effect, but to actually heal that bone, you still need many, many, many weeks. And the brain is, just so much more complicated. So I think there's just some immediate things and then some longer term things that occur.
Yeah. From a practical standpoint, as far as trying to use exercise as a tool to improve your learning, would it make sense to, let's say you had to do some studying, or you had, I don't know, something that you were going to learn from, would it make sense to add exercise in, let's say like an hour before, or is that not, like you said, sometimes it's more of a long-term thing? Does that not actually work?
You know, that's a really good question, because I actually don't know, like, if we had to think about, like, temporally, when do you put in exercise, like, when would it be most beneficial? I don't actually know if people have studied that, because, like, sleep, we know that sleep consolidates learning and memory. So let's say you've been studying, then if you go to sleep, your brain continues to kind of, I guess, consolidate what you have learned in order to kind of put it more coherently into your mind. So it's
Right.
actually doing something during your sleep. But obviously,
Yeah.
like, sleep follows learning, right?
Right.
I don't know if there's like a temporal kind of correlate to exercise. So, like, let's say if I worked out a little bit beforehand and I had this like clear headedness, would that be conducive to learning, or am I just like too freaking tired and I just don't feel like it?
Right.
Or do I learn and then, then have a workout to just kind of clear out those cobwebs and get the blood going? I don't know. I think that's an excellent question. And I don't have a good answer for that.
Yeah, because sometimes after I work out, I feel very clear-headed, and I
Yeah.
feel very sharp and
Yeah.
focused. But then there's other times I feel like my mind feels very foggy, and I
Yeah.
can't really think. Maybe it varies in the intensity of the exercise.
Yeah.
But what might be happening there on those times where I just worked out, and then afterwards, like I don't feel mentally sharp at all. Like I can't think very clearly. Is that just yeah, I exhausted some resources there, or from the
Yeah.
exercise?
I don't know. That would be my speculation. Like, it's the brain and body are so connected. So if you just tired your
Mm-hmm.
body out so much that maybe your brain's like, okay, physiologically it just makes actually sense to chill and just allow your body to recuperate from a really intense workout. But
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, like, maybe you didn't hit that edge quite so much and you're just in a more receptive state. So I
Right.
think it would probably depend on a constellation of factors. And I guess my kind of non scientific response to that would be probably to allow your body to cue you,
Right.
So because we're working so much with students, I sometimes say, like, if you need a break from studying, it's probably not a bad idea to go work out. Like, I don't see a downside,
Right.
but you might not feel like studying afterwards. So kind of pace it like that. But they're like saying, well, I was already kind of done with it. So that's sort of a nice way of, breaking it up.
Mm-hmm.
But then I also have students who have said, oh, yeah, after this exercise session, like, I just got this crazy binge, and that's great. So, that just suggests that you kind of have to go with the flow. But I don't know how much evidence there is in terms of when to best schedule exercise in order to facilitate learning. I have no idea if that work has been done. And again, maybe the cop out answer is it might differ for different folks.
Right. Yeah, I guess it really differs from person to person what the effects they're going to receive from exercise. But in general, it seems like the effects you get from exercise are plenty. Do you know of any like theories, or maybe there's a widely accepted theory as to why exercise provides us with all these benefits, like an evolutionary theory, like some reasoning that just indicates if you're exercising, you're on a good path. Like in human history, perhaps if you were out there moving around, it meant you're doing the right thing, or maybe because you're out there moving, you're more likely to be in a survival scenario. And it's I don't really know what the reason it might be. Is there something in your field that has kind of been accepted, or is it still up for debate?
Yeah, I don't know if there's any kind of like evolutionary perspective other than, humans have been sort of built to be sort of optimized machines, and exercise probably like historically has always just been integrated in that
Mm-hmm.
optimization, because you're plowing the field, or you're a hunter and gatherer society, or you're interacting within your community, blah blah blah, or expressing yourself through dance, and that kind of has a an optimized sort of physiological state, which then translates to an optimized brain state. When we're
Mm-hmm.
looking at our current society, where so many of us are so much more sedentary and the stressors are just fundamentally different, I think we have
Mm-hmm.
to kind of build in exercise in order to maintain that optimized state, or maybe even push it a little bit further with some of the rat work that has shown us that, actually cardiovascular exercise is really kind of good for our brain, and it's this permissive state for maybe better mental flexibility. But I don't know if maybe there's some theorists out there that probably have a better response and have thought about sort of the evolutionary drive for exercise to a certain extent, and how that translates to kind of more optimal functioning. Yeah, I'd love to hear what some of those other experts
Right,
say
right.
about that.
But I guess, yeah, the theory aside, we do know now it is beneficial, and to me it almost seems like a lot of the things that are slightly uncomfortable, like exercise, what comes to mind is cold showers or sauna, which I know both do have some benefits on the mind as well. It just seems interesting to me that the things that are slightly uncomfortable end up producing some positive benefits. What do you think about that? Like that the benefits are almost behind a door of discomfort in some ways.
Right. Well, I think again, it kind of like loops back to kind of human nature. Like, so
Mm-hmm.
I think humans are inherently kind of hedonistic. We like what we like, and, um, we'll gravitate towards that. But that hedonism sometimes can drive us to some bad things, whether it's like
Mm-hmm.
overindulgence of sweets. Like, I mean, we're kind of wired to love sweets, but because they're everywhere,
Mm-hmm.
if we indulge too extensively, we're just going to be quite obese and unhealthy and have terrible teeth, for instance.
Yeah, yeah.
And same thing with like, media consumption. Like, we're driven and kind of wired to be in tune to it. Like, our attention span, it really is into, some of these algorithms of how like media is constructed. So I don't know if it's necessarily that bad things make us feel better, or like things that kind of promote health are just a little bit uncomfortable because they're not inherently easy, right?
Right.
So I think the body and the mind thrives within perhaps a space that is occasionally a little bit uncomfortable. But I don't I don't know if like maybe if we lived in a totally utopian society free of stress, whether we would need to feel discomfort in order to feel good, or everything would just be so conducive to feeling kind of nice.
Right.
But I think a fundamental human condition, and again, maybe there's philosophers who would totally disagree with me, is like a little bit of discomfort is something that humans kind of like to a certain extent when
Right.
it's, and everybody's threshold is different, right? But like, how do you know you've accomplished something if everything is fundamentally easy, right? It almost
Right.
becomes like a philosophical question,
Yeah.
which is why like when you train, you generally get to a spot where like running becomes super super easy, but then most of us push ourselves a little bit more because
Right.
it's no longer kind of challenging, and it's no longer as fun as it used to be, or whatever, or we just want to test our own boundaries because most of
Right.
us kind of are driven for that. So I think
Yeah.
that's like I think that's one for the philosophers, I guess.
Right. Right. But yeah, it does seem like we kind of have an intuition that pushing ourselves is going to lead to improvements.
Yeah.
Because when you are on the run, it seems like people have a tendency to go to the point where it starts to feel a little bit uncomfortable,
Right.
and you kind of understand that if you're not near that point, you're not really getting many benefits. And perhaps it's the contrast between the discomfort of exercise that leads to some of the stress benefits, right? Like if you're exercising and putting yourself through uncomfortable situations over and over and over again, maybe in comparison, the stress you have at work or the stress you have elsewhere just isn't as big of a deal anymore, because you've been under like intense physical stress when you're lifting weights or running whatever distance it is. Yeah, and the learning benefits I find pretty fascinating. Is there an improvement? Because I like anecdotally, I find I get a benefit in attention from exercise. Is there something like concrete in the neuroscience perspective that would indicate why I'm getting that benefit in attention?
Yeah. So again, most of the studies have to do with like the more longer term benefits. So even in our own sample, we kind of put our participants through a cognitive battery before and after the exercise intervention. I don't think we're probably going to see that much because, truth be told, like these are pretty well functioning kids who are still in university, and we may already be at kind of a ceiling effect.
Yeah.
But in the older cohorts where there's starting to be a little bit of cognitive decline that just occurs with very natural aging, in individuals who are older with depression and who have had exercise intervention, they do seem to actually do better on a bunch of cognitive tests and attention and working memory. So, you know, when you have to kind of actively remember things in particular seem to be improved. One of the theories has to do with just kind of brain restructuring, rewiring. Some of the theories liken it back to that hippocampus, which is involved in memory. So if we're saying, okay, we're going to actually restructure this hippocampal region, it's functioning a little bit better. It seems to have more neurons. Perhaps that translates directly to, you know, better memory. I think that's kind of been now thought as a little bit too simplistic, but it's one of the kind of, again, models that tries to draw a really direct link between what occurs in the brain and actually, like, you know, how we do cognitively. But the idea is, again, you're getting more efficient kind of brain activity,
Right.
which could underlie that. But then there's other theories that suggest, well, maybe it's just, you know, kind of the stuff that you were mentioning, like you're actually better at modulating stress. And so when you're better at modulating stress, you can think a little bit more clearly in those circumstances and problem solve a little bit better. I mean, that still loops back to some brain changes, but they're just a little bit more difficult to link directly with improved cognition.
Right. Let's say there's some people listening to this right now and they're thinking, okay, great. Like I want those benefits in mental health, anxiety, stress reduction. I want the benefits that are associated with the learning and attention. What's the minimum I need to do? And there maybe there's two camps out there that are thinking, I want all those benefits and I want as much as I can. What's the like upper limit? Maybe that's harder to say. But is there a minimum, or is it really just going to vary person to person?
Yeah, I think we're just starting to scratch the surface of that. So generally the work for like more sustained benefits tends to be that like longer is better.
Yeah.
But I mean, we've only really studied, you know, exercise intervention length so long, right? So you can't also keep somebody like enrolled in a trial forever.
Yeah.
They'll just tell you to piss off. Like that's just not fair. But we do see that, like, you know, 8 to 12 weeks is kind of what's required to see some of the neural changes, at least the way we're investigating them. Now, maybe they're flawed. So those are generally kind of the minimum times that we work with, because we also know that neural changes take a while. But again, it's a little bit artificial because it's in the context of the laboratory.
And this is aerobic exercise.
That's
right.
right. That's right. So where you're kind of like making sure that you're using oxygen. But then there's this whole field of like, you know, HIIT training, which really kind kind of makes the case for just like spurts of intensity and then chilling out.
Right.
And I don't think we have the evidence for anything quite yet. It seems like some of the hit literature seems to be pretty promising. So shorter bursts seem to create pretty good neural benefits as well. But
Right.
we haven't really extended it to like mental health, right? So
Right.
that is one thing that I would really like to study, and it's kind of, you know, the impetus for my current work is like, does intensity matter? So intensity is sort of what I'm focused on, but I've kept the duration the same. So it's still 3 times per week. They exercise for 30 minutes at a particular intensity for 12 weeks. And that's kind of where I'm starting from. But I mean, ultimately, I think all of these parameters would be important to study. But I think they're always going to be complicated by things like personality and motivation, you know, and we're seeing some sex specific effects. So females are more likely to enroll in exercise intervention trials because they want to like change their body image, for instance. Like that's sort of a self-reported thing, while males might have different motivations. And so even when we're starting from that footing, you know, then a longer exercise intervention may have certain results for females than it might males, because, you know, they may take longer to attain certain physical accomplishments, et cetera,
Right.
et cetera. So I think it's really kind of a question that deserves attention, but it's very much in its infancy in the context of sort of mental health research.
Right. And aerobic exercise is the type of exercise that we know the most about, right? Because a lot
Right.
of the results come from animal studies.
That's right. So
Yeah.
it's basically the type of exercise wherein your muscles require oxygen versus anaerobic where they don't, where you're kind of running on like lactic acid and whatnot. And it
Yeah.
does seem that there's more evidence for the aerobic type of exercise being more beneficial from a cognitive and a neural reshaping perspective. Although I think there's a lot of people who might challenge that and say, well, we just haven't studied different types of exercises extensively.
Right.
And so really, what are you saying? Like, is this a valid conclusion?
Yeah.
I mean, I think we look at changes also in cardiovascular health. So one of the indices that I use is just consumption of oxygen, and that changes with exercise. So if you're doing cardiovascular fitness, presumably over time that value improves. And so what we've been looking is whether changes in cardiovascular fitness, whether the degree of those changes might correlate with the degree of mental health benefits. And then you can kind of make the argument that maybe like the cardiovascular fitness extent may matter because it's sort of what might be playing a role in some of these outcome measures. But I think it's going to be a hard case to make. And I think we just need to look at it. And you know, then there's a lot of work on like the benefits of yoga.
Right. Right.
It's a type of exercise intervention that, you know, traditionally isn't super, super intense, but seems to have really great effects as well in some folks. But we don't know whether necessarily that's so much of a cardiovascular thing. Probably not. Maybe it's more of a stress regulation thing via slightly different routes.
Right. When you're analyzing the aerobic exercise, are you focused on getting the youth up to a specific heart rate?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's it.
What percent is it? Like 70?
So it depends on which group they're allocated to. So we randomly kind of allocate them to moderate intensity exercise and high intensity exercise. So by the end of the exercise intervention, so we do it kind of in a graded fashion. We don't push them right away. But by the end of the exercise intervention for the high intensity folks, they're exercising at 80% of their heart rate reserve. So it's pretty intense. Actually, they're pushing quite hard.
Right.
For the moderate intensity folk, I think we peter out at around 55 to 60%, one of those two. So it's not as intense. So they're not they're not sweating as much at the
Right,
end,
right.
basically.
And are the results in at all in any way as to like which one might be better?
No,
No,
no. I
hard to
mean,
say.
when I looked at the preliminary analyses right now, it doesn't seem like there's much of an effect.
Yeah,
But I think that's a sample size issue.
right,
And we're also trying to maintain blindness. So my students don't know who is in what. Only I kind of glanced at the data super quickly
right,
just to make sure that there isn't anything of major concern. And so far, I've got nothing.
right,
But there are some studies that suggest going harder is a little bit better.
right. Yeah, it seems like a very difficult process to come up with concrete results where you can say for sure, yes, this is better.
100%.
And what do you have planned for the future? We've been going for a little over an hour, 50 minutes now, so I don't want to keep you too long. But one thing I do want to ask you, unless you're open to discuss, I'm sure there's lots we could discuss. But what do you have in mind for your practice in, let's say, the next 3 to 5 years? What do you want to try to accomplish or try to sort out as far as something that's currently unknown that you would like to uncover?
I would really, really like to get at the answer of, does intensity matter? Like, first of all, I'd love to answer it from a more neuroscience perspective. Does intensity matter when it comes to brain structure, brain function, brain wiring? I don't think I'll be able to answer it because I think that's just really, really difficult.
Mm-hmm.
But perhaps I might be able to answer it from a clinical perspective. So, even if... let's say we enroll like 20 youth in arm A and 20 youth in arm B, which actually takes a heck of a lot of work. And they're both doing great. Well, maybe that's hinting at the fact that like exercise of any intensity doesn't seem to matter.
Right.
But maybe that will lead me down a slightly different path, that if I continue to follow these youth for a couple of years, like do some of the changes stick for longer? And maybe that's where high intensity exercise might come into play. I think there's so many ways we could tease it apart. But I think if I could just have some semblance of an answer to that question, that would make me pretty darn happy.
Right.
I think, comparing it to a stretching exercise is pretty important. And I have a lot of folks who are more kind of in personal fitness who really believe that HIIT is the way to go. So I think there's numerous ways we can kind of start teasing this apart a little bit more and collecting more and more data. And I think I would like to kind of combine my work with those of other scientists, because I don't think we can really get at answering some of these questions when we're sort of siloed and doing our own individual work in our own labs. Like, I think we need a lot more data to answer some of these questions a little bit more definitively. At the same time, I think, I have kind of scientific goals, but then there's sort of like clinical and patient-oriented goals.
Yeah.
And they couldn't care less. Like, they just want to know, like, is this going to make me feel better? Right. And I think if I could get also answers to some of those like patient-focused goals, that would be a pretty big win for me as well. If I could say, you know what, if you're this type of a personality and if you exercise for 12 weeks, chances are pretty good you'll probably feel a little bit better. Yeah. I think that's kind of clinically really important. And I mean, clinicians sort of want some answers too. Like, before they're going to prescribe exercise as an intervention, they need to know, well, who am I going to prescribe this to? Because I don't just prescribe any drug to anyone. Like, I kind of need to know that their profile fits. Right. But I think that's a longer term goal of mine. And I think my more immediate goal is just to say, okay, does intensity matter? Can I even get a hint at that? And I think that would be pretty good. Yeah, that'd be awesome if you were able to uncover all of that. And it sounds like you've got a lot of complex goals ahead of you, which for you hopefully find very rewarding and enjoy the whole process. But it's been great to have you on, Natalia. I really appreciate you coming on. I think we'll wrap this podcast up now. Thank you so much, Ollie. This was so much fun. All right. Thanks, Natalia. Goodbye, everybody.